Some weapons erase the idea of surrender. Men carrying them learned this quickly. They moved differently, spoke less, and understood a rule that was never written into any field manual. If captured, they were not prisoners in the ordinary sense. They were something else. A memory of fire walking on two legs. Survival, for them, depended less on the white cloth of surrender than on whether the enemy believed mercy still belonged on that battlefield. Across multiple fronts of the Second World War, soldiers assigned to flamethrower units occupied a strange and dangerous space between specialist and outcast. Their weapon was designed for a specific problem: fortified positions that rifles, grenades, and artillery could not reliably clear without prolonged loss. In theory, it was a tool of efficiency. In practice, it became a symbol. And symbols have consequences that travel further than tactics ever intended. The landscapes where flamethrowers mattered most were not open fields. They were places where the earth had been hollowed out and hardened. Bunkers layered in timber and earth. Concrete firing slits no wider than a man's forearm. Cellars turned into fighting positions. Forests thick enough to swallow an entire company. Cities reduced to vertical mazes of rubble. These environments negated distance. They swallowed artillery effects. They turned every approach into a blind corner. In the forests of the Hürtgen, defensive positions became almost invisible beneath the shattered canopy. In the rubble of Stalingrad, every basement window could hide a machine gun nest. Each theater presented variations of the same tactical nightmare: defenders who could kill without exposing themselves, positions that conventional weapons could suppress but not eliminate. German defensive doctrine, especially by the middle years of the war, relied heavily on such terrain. Defense in depth, interlocking fields of fire, machine guns positioned not only to kill, but to shape movement, strong points designed to be bypassed, then reactivated against the attacker's rear. It was efficient, economical, and brutally logical, but it created a recurring problem for the attacker. How do you remove a defender who does not need to expose himself? The mathematics of such assaults were grim. A single well-placed machine gun in a concrete emplacement could hold a company at bay for hours. Grenades required someone to get close enough to throw them, often across open ground swept by fire. Artillery could collapse entrances, but rarely killed everyone inside. The defenders could wait, conserve ammunition, and exact a terrible toll on each approach. The answer from multiple armies was controlled fire. Flamethrowers were not issued widely. They were heavy, mechanically temperamental, and required training that went beyond marksmanship. Fuel mixtures had to be prepared, pressure systems maintained, ignition mechanisms checked under stress. Operators carried not just a weapon, but a system. Tanks, hoses, valves, ignition triggers, all of which could fail in mud, cold, or shrapnel shock. The flame stream had limited range, and the operator had to move close enough to see the enemy's face. The weight alone was punishing. A fully loaded M2 flamethrower weighed approximately 68 pounds when fuel tanks were filled. German Flammenwerfer models carried similar burdens. Moving under fire with that weight across broken terrain required physical conditioning that exceeded normal infantry standards. Operators often trained for weeks on movement alone before ever igniting their weapons. Mechanical reliability was a constant concern. Pressure had to be maintained precisely. Too low, and the stream would fall short. Too high, and seals could fail. Ignition systems relied on various mechanisms: electrical igniters, blank cartridges, or chemical reactions. Each had failure modes. Mud could clog nozzles, cold could thicken fuel, shrapnel could puncture tanks. Doctrine described them as assault support weapons. In reality, they were psychological tools as much as physical ones. A single burst of fire into a bunker entrance could achieve what hours of gunfire could not. It forced a decision inside: stay and suffocate, or run into waiting rifles. The weapon collapsed time. It ended stalemates. The physics explained its effectiveness. Fire consumed oxygen rapidly in enclosed spaces. Even defenders untouched by flames often died from asphyxiation within seconds. The psychological effect was equally devastating. Men who had endured artillery for hours sometimes broke after a single flame attack, but it also rewrote how the enemy saw the man holding it. German soldiers were not strangers to flamethrowers. They fielded their own units with similar tactical roles. Training films emphasized coordination, protection, and the importance of neutralizing enemy flamethrower teams first. Intelligence summaries noted their impact on morale. After-action reports, however, carried a different tone. Words like fanatical resistance and no quarter given appeared with increasing frequency around engagements involving flame weapons. German flamethrower units had their own distinguished and controversial history. The Flammenwerfer had been deployed as early as 1915 when German forces used them in the trenches of the Western Front. By the Second World War, specialized pioneer units carried updated versions. They faced the same dilemmas as their Allied counterparts: effectiveness balanced against special targeting by enemies who had learned to fear them. This was not policy written on paper. It emerged from experience. A machine gunner in a forward position could imagine the enemy soldier as a distant figure, one more shape in the terrain. A flamethrower operator shattered that abstraction. He approached within shouting distance. His weapon did not simply wound, it transformed enclosed spaces into traps. Survivors of such attacks often carried more than physical injuries. They carried the memory of air itself turning hostile. The intimacy of flame warfare distinguished it from other forms of combat. Artillery killed from miles away. Snipers fired from concealment at ranges that made targets anonymous. But a flamethrower operator closed to within yards. He saw the position he was about to incinerate. Sometimes he heard voices from inside. In that atmosphere, capture became personal. One American infantryman later recalled watching a German bunker being reduced by a flamethrower team. He remembered the sound most of all. Not screams, but the sudden silence of the machine gun that had pinned them for an hour. When the position was taken, there were no prisoners. Days later, his unit encountered a German soldier wearing a fuel tank harness separated from his squad. He raised his hands. The memory of the bunker was still fresh. Nobody wanted to be the one to take him back, the infantryman said. He wasn't just a soldier to us. The silence he described was characteristic. Flame attacks often produced no screaming because they killed too quickly for victims to react. For attacking soldiers waiting nearby, that sudden quiet was often more disturbing than noise would have been. On the other side, German defenders learned to identify the silhouette early. Twin cylinders, hose over the shoulder, a posture bent slightly forward under weight. Machine guns were reoriented. Mortar crews were warned. Snipers were told to watch for them specifically. The logic was simple: neutralize the fire before it reaches the wire. Defensive countermeasures became increasingly sophisticated. German units developed specific protocols for identifying and targeting flamethrower operators during approach. Observation posts were trained to spot the distinctive profile. In some sectors, standing orders required immediate concentration of fire on identified operators, even at the cost of ignoring other threats. But what happened when one was captured alive existed in a gray space between fear, anger, and the laws of war. A German veteran of the Eastern Front described an assault near a fortified village. Soviet troops used flamethrowers to clear cellars one by one. His platoon withdrew to a secondary line. Later, during a counterattack, they overran a Soviet position and found a wounded flamethrower operator who could not move. Some said he should be sent back, the veteran recalled decades later. Others said he had burned our wounded. No one knew for sure. The officers were not there. It was cold. Everyone was tired. Things happened quickly. He did not say more. He did not need to. The Eastern Front was particularly brutal in this regard. The ideological nature of the conflict already reduced restraints on both sides. Prisoners of all types faced heightened risks. For flamethrower operators, these already elevated risks increased further. Soviet and German flame troops alike understood that capture on this front carried odds that other prisoners did not face. The flamethrower operator lived inside a contradiction. His weapon could save lives, ending resistance quickly, preventing drawn-out firefights that consumed entire units. Yet every use deepened the emotional charge around it. Effectiveness carried a cost measured not only in fuel and maintenance, but in how enemies responded. The operators themselves understood this. Training emphasized aggression and speed. Hesitation near a bunker entrance could mean death. The tanks on their backs were vulnerable to bullets and fragments. Stories circulated, some exaggerated, some real, of fuel igniting, of operators targeted first, of rescue being impossible under fire. The job required a particular mental narrowing. Focus on the task, not on what the enemy might do if roles were reversed. The vulnerability was real. A single rifle round through fuel tanks could create a fireball, killing not only the operator, but anyone nearby. Operators learned to move in ways that minimized their profile, to use terrain obsessively, to stay behind cover until the final approach. Still, they thought about it. A British assault engineer wrote in his diary before a major operation that he had sewn his name inside his tunic. "In case they find me without the kit," he noted. The kit meant the flamethrower assembly. Without it, he might pass for an ordinary infantryman. With it, he felt marked. "The others joke," he wrote, "but they stand a little further away when we move up." His precaution was not unusual. Many flamethrower operators developed similar practices, removing identifying equipment when possible, carrying standard infantry weapons as alternatives. These adaptations reflected practical assessment rather than cowardice. German soldiers felt a similar distance from their own flame units. Respect mixed with unease. These were necessary men, but their presence signaled a certain kind of fight. Close, enclosed, desperate. When German flamethrower teams were captured by Allied forces, the same tensions appeared in reverse. Reports from multiple fronts suggest that while many were processed as prisoners, others faced immediate retaliation, especially in the aftermath of positions cleared by fire. System met system, and the space for restraint narrowed. Command structures officially upheld the laws governing prisoners of war. But battlefields are fragmented places. Squads become isolated. Officers fall. Communications fail. Decisions compress into seconds. In those moments, soldiers often acted not as representatives of doctrine, but as carriers of recent memory. The gap between official policy and frontline reality existed for all prisoners, but widened significantly for flamethrower troops. Headquarters could issue orders about proper treatment. Geneva Convention provisions could be cited in training, but none of that traveled with exhausted soldiers who encountered a captured flame operator moments after watching friends die. The presence of flamethrowers intensified this compression. Their use often followed fierce resistance. Casualties on both sides were already high. Smoke, debris, and shock blurred perception. A captured operator might be seen not as a surrendering individual, but as the embodiment of what had just happened meters away. This did not occur everywhere, nor all the time. Many flamethrower troops survived capture and entered prisoner systems like others, but the risk envelope around them was undeniably tighter. The weapon's reputation preceded the man. There was also the practical problem of handling them. Flamethrower gear was bulky and dangerous. Fuel residues, pressure systems, and ignition components required careful disassembly. Guards unfamiliar with the equipment sometimes treated operators as immediate hazards. In the confusion of frontline capture, technical caution blended with suspicion. Even cooperative prisoners presented challenges. A flamethrower operator who genuinely wished to surrender still carried equipment that could explode if mishandled. Guards who had never seen the weapons often assumed the worst about any movement near tanks or hoses. For the operators, this translated into constant awareness that their survival odds fluctuated wildly depending on who held the rifle pointed at them and what that man had experienced in the previous hour. One former German soldier, captured in the West while assigned to a flame unit, described throwing himself flat and shouting that he was an engineer, not a flamethrower man, as American troops advanced. His tanks had been damaged and left behind. "I did not lie," he said later, "but I did not tell everything either." He spent the rest of the war in a camp. Others he knew had not been so fortunate when captured immediately after flame assaults. The cost of effectiveness extended beyond the battlefield. After the war, many veterans who had served as flamethrower operators spoke little about it, not out of pride, but because the role carried a psychological residue. They had been sent to do a job others could not. They had done it. But they had also lived under the shadow of knowing that, in the enemy's eyes, they might not be entitled to the same mercy they were trained to extend. German soldiers who had faced them carried their own residue. Even decades later, interviews often shifted tone when flame weapons were mentioned. Voices lowered, pauses lengthened. The memories were not cinematic, they were claustrophobic, of air running out, of exits blocked, of fire behaving in ways that defied expectation. Survivors described sensory details that remained vivid across decades. The particular sound of ignition, the color of flame at different distances, the smell of fuel and burning material. These memories resisted the softening that time applied to other combat experiences. In that shared memory, the boundary between lawful combat and personal vengeance had often blurred. Wars are shaped by systems, logistics chains, production quotas, doctrinal manuals. Flamethrowers fit neatly into those systems on paper. They solved tactical equations. They reduced strong points. They conserved manpower in certain scenarios. But they also generated emotional shockwaves that systems did not account for. Captured flamethrower troops stood at the intersection of those shockwaves. Their treatment varied with circumstance, leadership, discipline, and the emotional temperature of the moment. Some were marched to the rear under guard, frightened but alive. Others disappeared into the unrecorded spaces of battle, where fear and memory outweighed regulation. There is no single story that defines what German soldiers did to captured flamethrower troops, just as there is no single story of how flamethrower troops treated those they fought. There is instead a pattern. A weapon designed to end resistance quickly also eroded the fragile protections meant to govern surrender. In the aftermath of fighting, when the smoke thinned and the noise receded, surviving soldiers on both sides often found themselves in the same position, sitting against a wall or a tree, hands shaking slightly, aware they were still alive while others were not. Some remembered faces, some tried not to. The men who had carried fire and the men who had faced it carried something else home as well. The knowledge that certain tools change not only battlefields, but the limits of what frightened human beings believe they can justify. Years later, in quiet rooms, veterans sometimes return to a single image, a figure with tanks on his back, seen for a moment through smoke, not as a monster, not as a hero, just as a man walking towards something no one else wanted to approach. And in that memory, the war never fully ended.